Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to George Barros of the Institute for the Study of War about the Russian military's gains in Ukraine and whether the U.S. will, or should, allow Ukraine to use American weapons to strike targets inside Russia. Then we dive into the potential political instability inside Iran, the prospect of the U.S. putting nuclear weapons back in South Korea, and the dangers posed by garbage. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. This week, we're going to have a deep dive later in the show on the Russia-Ukraine war and a lot of the developments we're seeing this week on that front, including the chances that the U.S. might allow Ukraine to potentially use U.S.-provided weapons for strikes against targets on Russian soil, which would be a big deal, obviously. But, Guy, before we get into all of that, as always, tell me what's on your radar right now.
Well, thanks, Ben. It's great to be here once again. One thing I'm paying close attention to is the major gathering of defense officials from nations around the world occurring in Singapore for the so-called annual Shangri-La dialogue. It's the seminal annual event of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, actually a British think tank, held at the Shangri-La Hotel in Singapore to focus on Asian and particularly Southeast Asian security issues. The reason this conference matters is because it's a who's who of top officials, not just from the U.S. and its allies in the region. Note that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is there with a delegation from the Pentagon, but also because the Chinese Communist Party usually sends a delegation as well. And U.S.-China tensions, as well as China's growing military aggressiveness in the region, from building military bases on man-made islands in disputed waters of the South China Sea to increasingly robust and threatening Chinese military drills around the U.S.-backed island democracy of Taiwan, tend to take center stage at Shangri-La. Remember, last year the conference made global headlines because then Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu and Lloyd Austin gave competing speeches. Li Shangfu essentially announced that while China seeks a peaceful reunification with Taiwan, it will make no promise not to use force if necessary to make the island democracy part of China. While Austin gave a speech openly criticizing China for its increasingly aggressive military actions in the region. Remember, also at the time, direct U.S.-China military communication or deconfliction talks between the two were frozen amid wider U.S.-China tensions. Of course, such talks have actually resumed in recent months, albeit to little fanfare, but there were 2 days of working level talks that took place between Chinese and U.S. military officials in Hawaii in early April. So this time around at Shangri-La, Beijing is sending its new defense minister, Chinese Navy Admiral Dong Jun, and all eyes are watching to see how he interacts with Lloyd Austin and what the two say in speeches. You know, will both sides try and tamp down the aggressive rhetoric toward each other, or will sparks fly? And sometimes it takes a few days to digest what happened at Shangri-La, so we'll be watching closely. One thing to note is that a bipartisan delegation of U.S. lawmakers, headed by House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Michael McCaul, is also at Shangri-La. They went directly from Taiwan, where they just held a visit with Taiwan's new president.
It's going to be interesting as U.S.-China competition this century, continues and heats up in some regards, how these interactions at conferences like this play out between top level officials. So it's certainly something we'll keep our eye on here. Guy, I want to mention something that we highlighted in the Threat Status newsletter this week, but that didn't get as much attention as I think maybe it should have. And that's the question or the idea, I guess, of whether the U.S. ought to consider putting nuclear weapons back in South Korea. This came up because Senator Roger Wicker, a Mississippi Republican and the top GOP member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, floated the idea in a major U.S. military investment strategy that his office just put out. Now, look, maybe this is just politics and a way for a high-profile Republican to hit the Biden administration for perceived weakness in its foreign policy. But nevertheless, Wicker did say it as part of this pretty wide-ranging document, and it said the U.S. should consider, quote, the redeployment of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula to bolster deterrence on the Korean Peninsula, end quote. The U.S. in 1991, of course, under then-President George H.W. Bush, pulled out the roughly 100 nuclear weapons that the U.S. had stationed in South Korea. The U.S., of course, now still has nuclear capabilities abroad, mostly in Europe. Nuclear watchdogs say the U.S. has warheads deployed now in 5 European countries. So Wicker proposes this as part of deterrence, right? A deterrence strategy that we put nuclear weapons there. Maybe it deters Kim Jong-un from starting a conflict with South Korea. Maybe it has an impact on China's decision-making process in some way. I'm not sure. I don't really think Wicker is sure either, to be honest. But hey, at least I guess this is a new element to a debate on U.S.-North Korea policy that has kind of gotten stale during the Biden administration. It'd be a dramatic shift, of course, in the U.S. approach. It might be a lot harder if any administration wants to try to convince North Korea to abandon its own nuclear programs, the idea of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, if we have our own nukes, of course, back in South Korea. And by the way, it's worth mentioning, Guy, of course, that some prominent officials think that whole approach is flawed anyway. Former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper in February said at an event hosted by the Washington Times Foundation that he's an advocate for recognizing what he called reality, which is that North Korea is in fact a nuclear state, even if nobody wants to officially admit it. Now, coincidentally or not, this document came out around the same time that North Korea launched another round of ballistic missiles. And at the same time that the Defense Intelligence Agency said that it has clear evidence that Russia used ballistic missiles produced in North Korea for its war in Ukraine. So, maybe Wicker is just giving a voice to a school of thought that whatever we've been doing for decades now, from hardball geopolitics to Donald Trump's diplomatic olive branch to Kim Jong-un, none of that's worked, and we need something more dramatic. So what's your read on this, Guy? Is this just a throwaway proposal in a wonky policy document that gets forgotten by next week, or is there something more here?
Well, no, I think it's actually watched incredibly closely by national security officials on North Korea and China policy. I think you're right to highlight it. It's very interesting, the timing of it from Wicker. The first question, is this about China or is it about North Korea? Obviously, the Biden administration's re-implementation of so-called strategic patience, which is, not doing much of anything vis-a-vis the North Korea situation while the Kim Jong-un regime does increasingly aggressive provocations and missile tests. At the same time, China is on pace to acquire essentially and develop 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030. And there's always this debate about whether the U.S. presence on the Korean Peninsula is purely about deterring North Korea, protecting South Korea, or is it also about deterring China? And another piece of this that I think is interesting, Ben, is that what Wicker said, in my mind, it really contrasts with what Donald Trump said recently in an interview, I believe, with Time magazine, in which he set nerves soaring in South Korea by suggesting that if he wins the U.S. presidency in November, he'll push on Seoul to pay more toward housing the some 30,000 U.S. troops stationed in the country. There was also a good deal of talk when Trump was president about South Korea pursuing nuclear weapons, by the way. So this is not a new debate. I think it's interesting that Senator Wicker brought it up at this time.
And we are joined now by George Barros. He is the Russia team and geospatial intelligence team lead at the Institute for the Study of War, and someone who's obviously tracking the Russia-Ukraine war very closely. George, thank you so much for being on the show this week. I want to start with this. There was a story recently, a few days ago, from Reuters, quoting some unnamed Russian officials saying that Vladimir Putin is open to a ceasefire in Ukraine that would essentially freeze the battlefield along the current lines. And I'm not going to ask you, of course, to delve into the psyche of Vladimir Putin and why he might want to get that message across. But I wonder, as a journalist, you always say consider the source, and something like this only gets out if someone wants that narrative out there. So from a sort of battlefield perspective, do you get the sense, maybe are Putin's military advisors perhaps telling him, hey, we might be in the best position that we're going to be in right now, and maybe this is the chance to push for an end so we can permanently get a chunk of Ukraine under Russian control?
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you so much for having me, Ben. It's a pleasure to be on the show. Look, I don't think Putin is playing for any kind of negotiation. I really think this is a kabuki theater because we've seen the Kremlin do this before. There's been pointed moments where the Kremlin puts out these red herrings and they say, hey, we're interested in negotiations. We're open. We're interested in talking. Each time, I don't think it's actually come to fruition. And the Kremlin strategically deploys these at crucial moments when Washington and the West is actually at a very important juncture in our own policy debate. I think we're looking at another one of these things right now because I think the debate has reached sort of a fever pitch about whether or not Ukraine should be allowed to use Western provided weapons to strike Russian territory. And I think the fact that all of a sudden we're now seeing this renewed effort to float the idea that Russia's open to negotiations, I don't think that's an accident. And the Russians just started a new major offensive operation just 3 weeks ago on May 10 in Kharkiv that is still ongoing. They've not committed the majority of the operational force that they prepared for this operation. They have a bunch in reserves. There's no reason to think that they can't continue making advances. The Russian, force generation, their defense economy, they're able to actually grind out a whole bunch of more gains, I think, being Ukrainian materiel and manpower constraints what they are now. And there really is no incentive for the Russians to stop, if not just to try to get the West to put the brakes on what the West is willing to do.
You've watched the Russian military, obviously very closely throughout this conflict. I'm wondering how it's evolved or improved throughout the conflict. Did they learn lessons from those early days when everyone, myself included, was writing stories about this seeming incompetence and how the Russian military wasn't living up to its own expectations and this idea that it's, quote unquote, great power in the 21st century? Where are they today versus where they were almost 2.5 years ago now?
The Russian military today is more dangerous and more effective in terms of its execution of military operations than where it was in February 2022. The force has been, eviscerated. They've lost a tremendous amount of combat potential. Their officer corps has been more than decimated, but the Russians still exhibit a propensity for military learning and adaptation, and actually it translates to better performance on the battlefield. I'd like to draw attention specifically to the Russian use of glide bombs. For the exception of the first several weeks of the war in early 2022, the Russian Air Force was largely absent for the majority of 2022 and the majority of 2023 until fall 2023 and present, when the Russians discovered that actually they can have a form of combined arms warfare and get the Air Force back involved in the supporting an effective manner by kitting them out with the glide bombs and being able to actually use the glide bombs to physically destroy Ukrainian strong points to enable the infantry to be able to maneuver. The Ukrainians right now do not have the capacity to defend themselves from or defeat the glide bomb threat. And the Russians successfully employed the glide bomb starting in late 23 and early 2022 to seize Avdiivka. I mean, the glide bombs played a significant role in the seizure of that strong point. And the Russians are replicating that tactic now, not only with their Kharkiv operation, but all around the theater. And so, the ability for a Russian industry to think about, oh, well, what if we just took our old Soviet stockpile of the 500 kilogram bombs and put on a relatively cheap retrofit kit with wings and a guidance kit, and now we have sort of like a Soviet JDAM, if you will. That's technical adaptation. And then now with the way that they're using it as a standoff weapon to enable infantry ground maneuver, that demonstrates learning and new information and new knowledge that the Russians didn't have.
Two follow-ups on the glide bombs specifically. One, why is it, or I guess what would Ukraine need to do if there was going to be a strategy to defend against them, to sort of defeat that threat of the glide bombs? And another thing I'm curious about, have you seen any indication that whether it's glide bombs or any other any other capability the Russians have been using. Are there Chinese components in any of that stuff?
Yeah, I've not seen any confirmed information about Chinese sourcing going into supporting the glide bombs. I'm not going to say it's not there because I just simply don't know. That goes beyond what I can see in open source information. I do know that the Russians and the Ukrainians, for that matter, they rely a tremendous amount on Chinese manufacturing for drones. I mean, these little cheap FPV drones that are made. Regarding the glide bomb threat and what's necessary to defeat it, this is a tactical problem. This is not, I think, an operational problem. It's not a strategic problem. It's a tactical, technical problem, and it's actually really simple. The glide bombs, they're small. They fly on a relatively short trajectory, 40 to 60 kilometers. They have a very small radar cross section, and they're very difficult to intercept with surface to air, air to air interceptors. It might even be impossible. And even if it were possible, it doesn't make sense to spend an expensive Western-provided air interceptor on what is, a cheap Russian glide bomb that the Russians have at scale. So it's just not economical. What is potentially economical and is a potential way to defend against the glide bomb threat is to intercept the Russian aircraft before they get in range of their intended targets, destroy the aircraft, ideally kill the pilot who does the sorties. You deprive the Russian of the pilot, you deprive the Russians of the airframes, and the planes don't get to drop their bombs before they get in range of their intended targets. The other solution, and this is more escalatory, and I don't think it's necessary, but it's an alternative solution, is you can try to destroy the aircraft while they're still grounded on runways in Russia. So, but of course, that's more escalatory than intercepting the aircraft while they're in
And
flight.
the Biden administration wouldn't want the Ukrainians to use anything they're getting from us to do that on Russian soil.
Yeah, that's right. And that actually, opens up another interesting point, which is, we talk about the prohibition on using U.S. provided weaponry in Russian territory, but sort of like as a blanket, as a binary, like you can't do that. But I want to inject a little bit of nuance here because there is nuance here. There's degradations and degrees of which you evaluate targets and what can and cannot be struck. I think about it in crude terms in like 3 degrees minimum. I think it's reasonable to say there is a difference between striking Russian aircraft as they're lining up to drop glide bombs in Ukraine while they're still in Russian territory. That's different than striking, land targets. There's a difference between also second degree striking land targets that are clearly involved in actively executing offensive operations. That would be, the assembly areas and the logistics and the command and control stuff that the Russians have in Belgorod that are actively supporting the currently ongoing Kharkiv operation. The third and final degree is basically the Ukrainians strike everything that's a legitimate military target in Russia, irrespective of whether or not it's engaged in current combat operations. Those would be legitimate legal targets, but again, it's a third degree. We might not agree on the third degree of the Ukrainians can go gangbusters and hit everything that's a military target, but that doesn't mean that we can't necessarily take off the table striking stuff that is going to go into Ukraine anyway. It's just on the other side of the border. And it doesn't mean that we can't say that they're not allowed to defend against the aircraft and allow the aircraft to strike a territory the size of the Netherlands and Ukraine with impunity. And I think what the administration has done a little bit is they've communicated quite poorly about what the lines are.
The fear of escalation, which seems to have been, driving a lot of the Biden administration's, decision making over the past 2.5 years, is something that's been fascinating to me to watch. Because the same, as the same pattern plays out time and time again, whether you're talking about Patriot missile batteries or ATACMs, or we can go on and on about capabilities that the Biden administration slow walks for sometimes months, saying we don't want to provide this, and everybody knows the implication is the reason we're afraid there's going to be escalation. We don't want a nuclear conflict. And meanwhile, the Russians keep escalating, now more recently gaining ground. So I'm wondering, can you, without getting too deep into the political side of this, can you draw a direct link between some of what we've seen lately, the tide turning a little bit in Russia's favor, and the slow walking of some specific capabilities coming from the U.S. to Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's been interesting. The approach has seemed to have been not to actually send aid in the right volumes and quantities and the type of aid in such a manner to ensure Ukrainian success, but send enough to evade catastrophes so the Ukrainians don't fail spectacularly, but not enough to actually have them be too good. There's 2 poignant examples that I'll share, and they come from the last year. In November 2022, the Russians were on the ropes. This is following the successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv, where Ukrainians managed to go 60 kilometers into the Russian rear and destroy an entire division's worth of equipment in the span of about 2 weeks. the Russians were about to pull out from Kherson in the south. The Surovikin line, the extensive field fortifications, had not yet been dug. And, Vladimir Putin, out of desperation, just called his September 2022 partial mobilization of 300,000 reservists. Right. This was a time when the Russians really were on the ropes. The Ukrainians had the initiative. They were gaining in the north. They were gaining in the south. And the Russian lines were, I think, were
and Putin. Not to interrupt, George, but Putin was also under a lot of domestic pressure. I mean, this was in the months leading up to the Prigozhin rebellion in June of the following year. So there were a lot of things working against the Russians and their war effort at that time.
Precisely, yeah. And at that time, the debate space in the West was, do or do we not send the Ukrainians main battle tanks? We had already agreed to artillery and HIMARS and some other stuff, but it was like, do we do not send them main battle tanks? We did not do that in October, but there was a debate space for it. The Ukrainians had formally asked for it. If the Ukrainians had gotten the tanks sooner and had them fielded and readied, there's no saying like what could have some Ukrainian brigades equipped with Leopards and Abrams and Challengers, what they might have been able to do before those defensive lines had been dug and when the Russians were so weak. But what the Russians did at that time is, they called for nuclear readiness exercises. Shoigu and Gerasimov, they made a whole bunch of statements publicly about Russian nuclear readiness. There was like a very clear stimuli reaction response where the West, and Washington in particular, suddenly said, all right, we got to cool this down, like turn down the tank debate. And we didn't end up giving to the Ukrainians in time. So the Ukrainian momentum zeroed out. We got into a positional nature of war. The Russians had the time to do their mobilization. They had the time to dig their lines. And then it made the 23 counteroffensive that started in May that much harder to pull off. The second example comes from the counteroffensive of 23. There was a big debate about do we or do we not give the Ukrainians ATACMS to do deeper strikes. They had the HIMARS with a range of about 77 kilometers, but there were other things that they had to hit deeper in the rear. And one of the reasons why the Russian defense against the Ukrainian counteroffensive was successful was because, among other things, the Russians got to bring to bear an economy of different kinds of forces and weapon systems to blunt the Ukrainian offensive. They had, the trenches, they had the mines, they had field fortifications, they had artillery pre-positioned, they had anti-vehicle crews, and they also had electronic warfare and air asset defense. Russian attack helicopters were successfully able to take off from an airfield in Zaporizhia near the coast in Berdansk. They were able to fly sorties and interdict and strike the Ukrainian tanks and armored personnel carriers while they were trying to do their breaching. And it's really unfortunate that airfield was left intact because there's no reason why the Ukrainians should not have been able to use a deep strike to be able to take out that airfield.
No, that's a great point. Last thing, George, I want to ask about Starlink and Elon Musk and sort of the role that private industry and Starlink specifically has played in this war. I'm just wondering, do you see this as kind of an inherent part now of 21st century conflicts, or is this just a unique situation? Are we going to see, private capabilities owned by private individuals in, space, cyber domains at the center of warfare, and then as an extension of that, of course, as we saw with Elon Musk, potentially be in situations where companies or even a wealthy individual can more or less make a decision that can impact how a war plays out on the ground?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. Given that the current trajectory of private industry and the new capabilities that have come online in the recent decade, especially with the internet, I do think that it's likely that in the future of war, we'll probably see, private wealthy individuals who have unique assets and capabilities. They will probably wield those in ways that we've not seen before in this war. I was really astonished to see how the Ukrainians managed to crowdfund a whole bunch of cash to buy their own synthetic aperture radar satellite operated by ISI, right, which is I think it's a Finnish company, and they bought their own satellite for defense targeting and intelligence, right? So here we have like a private company selling to the Ukrainian military a capability, like a spaceborne capability, without you having to have a national level, government effort to put up your own spaceborne sensor. That's interesting. Seeing Elon Musk basically do the same thing with Starlink, that's interesting. And the reliance on technology is going to remain. I mean, so long as we're doing the Internet of Things and we're relying on precision strike and information to be able to make our operations better and more effective, we're going to continue relying on these technological gadgets, and whoever has the cash to be able to develop it and the keys, then I think we're going to definitely rely on them. We'll see who's going to be the good stewards and who's going to be the reckless stewards.
It's going to be fascinating to watch how that plays out. George Barros, thank you so much for joining us here on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Ben. Appreciate it.
And it's now time for Threat of the Week. This is our weekly segment here on the show where Guy and I each identify a threat that we think is affecting U.S. national security right now this week. So, Guy, what do you have for us for your Threat of the Week?
Ben, my threat of the week is Mideast instability stemming not just from the ongoing Israel-Hamas war, but especially from the recent sudden death of Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash. While there seems to be consensus within the U.S. national security establishment that the Raisi death is not connected to the Israel-Hamas war, essentially that it was a freak accident, there's also consensus that Raisi's death somehow won't impact Iran's posture in the region or relationship that Tehran has with its military proxies, including Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis in Yemen. I remain very wary of the potential regional blowback from Raisi's death. My threat of the week is that it will ultimately lead to more instability as Iran's Islamic Republican Guard Corps, the IRGC, solidifies its control of the government in Tehran and the Iranian economy. This will result in stronger relations between the IRGC and the proxies and essentially more robust proxy activity, and that will lead to more Mideast instability. That's my threat of the week, Ben.
Yeah, it's something we're going to be watching closely, obviously. Guy, my threat of the week is trash. It's actual trash, literal garbage. Washington Times Asia editor Andrew Salmon had a story on 260 filth balloons from North Korea that floated across the demilitarized zone into South Korea. And South Korean military officials said the balloons, some of which were equipped with timer devices designed to disperse their cargoes, dumped garbage and sacks of manure all across South Korea. Some reached apparently as far as 155 miles south of the border. Trash balloons would be funny if they weren't so serious. Now, North Korea isn't the only country that's got a garbage problem. Guy, back in 2020, I reported on a major issue along the coast of the Bering Strait in Alaska, where tribal leaders and federal agencies at the time said they witnessed a huge increase in the amount of plastics and other garbage washing ashore. A lot of it with Russian language labels on it, cans, bottles, bags, debris scattered across, an otherwise pristine Alaskan coast that really frustrated local officials. In 2021, U.S. experts said that swarms of Chinese vessels dumped human waste and wastewater into disputed areas of the South China Sea, causing algae blooms that damaged coral reefs and threatened fish in the region. It's a problem right now in Gaza, too. This week, a United Nations office posted on social media that, quote, everywhere you look, there is a pile of trash. And even before the war, officials said there were only 2 central waste disposal sites in Gaza to deal with about 1,700 tons of waste every day. Now, America doesn't get off the hook here either. In 2021, the U.S. was blamed for leaving behind huge amounts of stuff, garbage, in Afghanistan. Scientific American did a major study at the time about the toxic materials left behind at U.S. bases, including stuff that was burned in open-air pits, everything from food waste to paint, metal, plastics, medical, human waste, even unexploded ordnance, according to some reports. So, look, military operations are messy, of course, but everyone from the U.S. to China to Russia seems really bad at cleaning up after themselves, Guy. And that's a threat to me and you and basically every living thing on the planet, from humans to animals to plants. And that's why it's my threat of the week.
I think you're right on the money, Ben.
Thank you all so much for listening. Guy, thank you for joining me. Thank you to George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War for all his great insights this week. And please, all of you, go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with your friends, and we'll be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.